Rain Summit Europe, Hearthis automatic track listing, and big brands producing their own podcasts.
Welcome to the Richard Daly Podcast, bringing you a UK perspective on the latest news and developments from the world of podcasting and internet radio.
Welcome to episode 20. I'm your host, Richard Daly. Every week I curate and discuss the latest news on podcasting and internet radio with a focus on the smaller podcaster and radio host. Now, I know I'm a little bit late with this, but I'd like to start this week with my thoughts on the recent Rain Summit Europe conference. First off, I have to say this year's venue was much better than last year's. Rain Summit Europe this year was held at the British Museum in London, which has modern conference facilities and I think provides a much better experience than the Royal Institute, which has been used before. Now, of course, I'm not saying the Royal Institute isn't a lovely old building. It is, but I'm just finding the seating arrangements too uncomfortable for me for a full day. And the layout of the building makes it difficult to get around during the breaks. It can get a bit crowded in the doorway, shall we say. So on to the 2016 event. There were a wide range of speakers and topics covered in a packed day. I believe there were over 200 people in the audience, and I would say the vast majority of these came from larger broadcasting organisations, with quite a good representation from Europe, as well as a number of students from the Student Radio Association who were invited to attend for free by the organisers. I do suspect I was one of the few independents attending. Conference organiser and founder of Rain, Kurt Hansen, kicked things off with his State of the Industry address, which gave us a good picture of how the digital radio and podcasting worlds are growing in size. His key phrase for the year was the need for convenience, choice and control. He also said all the technology we need for the next 5 years is already here, it just needs more integration. So if you want to be an early adopter, then just go out and buy the following now: Bluetooth headphones, connected speakers, a voice control device like Amazon Echo, and an in-car player, your choice of Apple CarPlay or Android Auto. Matt Deegan hosted a panel discussion on the future of radio. This was very much the future of radio from the perspective of the big broadcasters and agencies, and it seemed to leave little room for the smaller networks and independent stations and podcasters. Ruth Fitzsimmons from Audio Boom made the frequently repeated point that there is a need to address measurements across the whole industry. She also said that a figure stated by Kurt for the number of podcast listeners in the UK, which I think was 4 million, was wrong, but that if it was correct, then Audio Boom is doing very well indeed. She also saw a slight shift happening towards streaming podcasts rather than downloading. Now, I have to say I'm surprised about this. I guess it's about the type of user and where you listen to podcasts. Now, streaming is of little use to me, and I mostly listen to podcasts on the train, where the signal tends to be rubbish, or when walking or out running, which would use too much of my data allowance. Ruth discussed that Apple dominates the US market, but that it's much more fragmented in Europe, and of course Apple has no dominance in India, for example, and so we shouldn't just be thinking about how to interact with Apple's technology. Another measurement point made by Ruth was that the audience doesn't care how they're listening, so how do you quantify listens across different devices and different applications? Another panellist, Simon Cole, the CEO of 7 Digital, talked about TuneIn, which he believes could play a vital part in the future. He sees TuneIn generating what he calls tribal listening. Simon also addressed what the audience wants, which is he sees as being able to switch easily between different types of listening, so from radio to a library of 53 million songs, to podcasts and to other types of media. Talking about radio having to develop to keep up with the streaming services, Simon noted that curation is the biggest skill that radio people have, and others are starting to steal it. For example, presenters moving from radio to Apple and Spotify. Companies like Apple and Spotify are really desperate to get these skills. Only this week Apple has advertised in the UK for a curation role in their own podcasting organisation. Now, I mentioned the figure of 53 million songs just now, and this was in fact brought up by several of the presenters and panellists during the day, but I think that we all know that only a fraction of these are really being listened to. Simon said that his service, 7 Digital, did 43 million streams in a month recently, and that was from just 10,000 songs. Megan Lasovic from Edison Research had a really slick presentation on some new research on how consumers really use the technology in their cars, including some quite frightening use of phones and dashboard devices while on the move. This was an interesting perspective as Megan used video clips of consumers talking about their own experiences and use cases for apps and devices in the car. Jason Phipps sat down for a one-on-one discussion on podcasting with Brad Hill, the president of Rain. Jason is the head of audio at The Guardian. This was an interesting insight into how The Guardian approaches podcasting. They have their own in-house multimedia studios and are producing 6 to 8 hours of content per week. The biggest podcast they have is their football show. Jason talks about commissioning niche topics for podcasts, which The Guardian doesn't cover elsewhere. For example, to create the kind of narrative type content which is now so popular in America. Jason went on to say that most podcasters come from a radio background. Now, I think he was talking about podcasters at The Guardian rather than generally, but it was rather a theme throughout the day that good podcasts only come from those with radio backgrounds, whether they be presenters or producers. And Jason himself came to The Guardian from BBC Radio. Jason noted that the awareness of Squarespace was much higher with podcast listeners, which just goes to show what we already know about the effectiveness of advertising on podcasts. Jason discussed the state of sales for advertising in the UK. He noted that all the salesmen are middle-aged white men who just have dad radios at home. The equivalent salespeople in the US, he says, are very diverse and all listen to podcasts. Now, another aside here, the one disappointing thing for me about this conference was the lack of diversity in general. As an example, in the afternoon there was a panel with 9 members and a host who would all probably fit into the same generalisation that Jason used for UK salespeople. And these were senior people in audio companies from around Europe and South America. Back to Jason Phipps now. He gave an insight into the importance of podcasting. It's bringing in $500,000 of advertising revenue globally for The Guardian, and this figure is growing every year. The Guardian is now starting to create brand engagements where podcast is part of the deal. An example of this he gave was with the car company Seat. In terms of technical developments, The Guardian is working to improve the analytics of audio internally. Jason said they are dedicating resource to this within their development team. He also noted that the Amazon Echo device has changed everything, even though he says the user experience is terrible. And he also said, just imagine how it will be when Apple enter this market, a real game changer. Addressing podcast listening in cars, Jason said that in-car audio needs to be voice controlled, and car companies and audio device manufacturers need to learn things from devices like the Amazon Echo. He sees no future for touch or text in the car, but perhaps not for the view that some people in The Guardian, he said, who think that once we have autopilot in cars, then people will start reading newspapers again. Jason said podcasts offer a unique opportunity for topics that wouldn't get into other platforms, for example, a podcast about sex. Now, you wouldn't listen to this on a radio in your kitchen in case your grandmother came in, but of course you can listen to it with headphones on the tube. Now, I think that's probably enough about the conference. Most of the rest of the day was more radio related, and although interesting, it probably doesn't merit discussion here. If and when recordings of the event are made available, I will be sure to post about it. Just another highlight of the day for me personally, I got to meet Brad Hill from Rain, who writes a lot of great content about podcasting for the Rain newsletter and their website. He did mention that they are looking to put on some podcasting specific events in the future, probably in the US, so look out for more on those. Omni Studio, they've launched a new feature called Podcast Discovery Feed, which gives listeners a new way to find and rate podcasts. The Omni Discovery Feed contains multiple shows and delivers personalised content to listeners every week. The feed's designed to help podcasters to get their show in front of new audiences and to allow listeners to discover new podcasts. The feed works in the same way as other podcast RSS feeds. Listeners subscribe to the feed using iTunes or their usual podcast app, and the feed contains short promo clips which describe what each show is about, followed by that show's most recent full episode. Now, a key feature of the feed is that listeners can vote yes or no to what they're hearing, which then affects the content they are delivered. The feed is apparently not just for shows hosted on the Omni Studio platform, and because they're using a feed, it means that plays of shows should be recorded in the usual statistics, for example if you're hosting with Libsyn. I haven't yet seen how one gets your own podcast into the feed, but this does seem like an idea that's worth exploring further, so watch this space for that one. I've talked about how important podcasting is to The Guardian already, and here's an article now from them entitled Podcasting. It builds trust, credibility and brand loyalty. The article discusses how entrepreneurs are investing time and money into podcasting as a way to boost the profile of their small businesses. One of the case studies in the article is award-winning podcaster Jo Milmine. Jo won the Best UK Podcast Award at the recent New Media Europe Awards for her podcast Shiny Bees, which is all about knitting. Shiny Bees gets more than 15,000 downloads per month and has helped Jo to start 2 businesses, both of which are related to her love of knitting. Jo is quoted as saying that she was very focused on building a community around the show because she wanted to talk to people and meet other knitters. And from these conversations, she realised there was a niche in the community for a subscription club that specialised in hand-dyed limited edition yarn, and she started her own membership site to meet this demand. We Bought Beer is a podcast from James Hickson, who has a company of the same name that has 3 craft beer shops in London. Hickson felt there was a gap in the market for a beer podcast that talks about craft beer from the perspective of the business rather than the consumer. He told The Guardian that it's one of those intangible things, but it builds trust, credibility, expertise, brand love, brand loyalty, and it's just a cool, fun thing to do. If anything, I'm doing it for myself as well. There are a couple more examples in the article, including podcasts from a lawyer and a financial advisor, and both of those have found business benefits from starting a podcast. Do have a read of the full article, as there is lots of advice on how to get the most benefit for your small business by starting a podcast. As always, I'll put a link in the show notes, which will be at richarddalley.com/20. News from iHeartRadio now. They've appointed ex-TuneIn executive Chris Peterson to lead their podcast strategy. Peterson's role will be to oversee iHeartRadio's overall podcast strategy and look to grow its profile in the podcast community. He's also going to be looking for content partnerships. He'll work with the product team on its podcast roadmap and work with the sales group to better monetize podcasting for the group. Peterson was previously content partnership manager at TuneIn, where he worked on their premium product. One of my favourite writers about podcasting, Lauren Johnson over at Adweek, has a new article out called Why Some Big Brands Are Starting to Produce Their Own Podcasts. In the article, Lauren discusses why some very large international companies such as General Electric, HBO and Intercontinental Hotels are making big investments in podcasting. The aim of these companies is to capitalise on the popularity of podcasts such as Serial and This American Life, to target their audiences and market to them using a more subtle light touch approach. Lauren spoke to Georgina Forster, managing director at Mirum, the agency behind Intercontinental's podcast, who said, "You look at the space now, and it's so crowded. Not many brands are creating their own editorial content, so we thought it would be a point of differentiation." The IHG podcasts focus on stories behind the brand, such as insights into some of the buildings in their hotel chains, and they are hosted by a well-known radio personality. GE has just started its second podcast. Its first one, The Message, ran for 2 months from October to November 2015 and netted 4.4 million downloads. In those first 8 weeks, an average of 450,000 people tuned into each episode. And after the series ended, another 900,000 downloads were made. Reflecting the success of the first series, the second podcast is going to have more episodes and longer content. Now, interestingly, Lauren notes in the article that after learning that consumers wanted longer content, each episode is now going to be 15 to 20 minutes long, up from the previous 10 to 15 minute length. The new series follows a widower who tries to connect with his late wife using voice recordings, uploaded to a fictional audio social platform called VoiceTree. References to a piece of General Electric software are sprinkled throughout the show, but there's no hard sell. After discussing other examples in detail, the article goes on to look at the budget needed for this kind of branded audio. It can be expensive, as the companies are employing agencies who then need to bring in professional production companies that specialise in audio content. Lauren suggests that mid-six-figure dollar investments are required, with one agency estimating that each episode of the sponsored podcast that they put together for a client costs $20,000 to $25,000 to produce. Finally, Lauren spoke to Max Linsky, the co-founder of Pineapple Street Media, which creates podcasts for publishers and brands. Max said that the boom in podcasts means that marketers need to up the ante with content that listeners can't find elsewhere. There is a great deal of awareness that podcasting is getting more competitive every day and that listeners have a ton to choose from. If it doesn't have some value for listeners, then it's just not going to work very well. It's too competitive of a medium, and the barrier to entry to get someone to try a new show is too high to not have it have pretty clear value from the start. It's got to be worth people's time. Really interesting article from Lauren there. Do check out the full article on Adweek or see my show notes at richarddalley.com/20. An article from Jessica Rhodes titled 4 Things That Make a Good Podcast Now. I really like this article as it looks at good podcasts from the perspective of the listener rather than from the podcaster, which we tend to see more often. So what are the 4 points that Jessica identifies? 1. It keeps you listening in your car even after you reach your destination. Is your podcast background noise, or does it keep listeners locked in until the last minute of your show? 2. It goes deep. Shows that are really engaging are shows that tell stories and allow the time and flexibility to go below the surface and to dive deep into content. It's honest. Listeners don't want to hear about your perfect life and your perfect business where nothing ever goes wrong in your perfect world. They want to hear your real or raw story. 4. Highlights the guest and the host. No matter how great your guests are, your listeners will keep coming back for you, the host. Remember, your audience wants to hear from you. So having discussed these 4 points in detail, the author then goes on to make another point. She asks, what truly makes your message matter? The answer, Jessica says, is the right audience. If the right people are listening to your podcast and are entertained and getting value, then your message matters. Another really interesting article, so do read the full piece. Again, link in the show notes. An announcement from Hearthis at hearthis.at now. Based in Germany, Hearthis.at is an audio distribution platform that enables its users to upload, record, promote and share their originally created sounds and mixes. In some way it's similar to SoundCloud, but it also provides facilities for artists to sell to their fans. The site has recently become increasingly popular as a home for DJ mixes, as SoundCloud has become more aggressive at pursuing copyright claims and taking content down. So Hearthis has introduced automatic track listing. They've teamed up with ACR Cloud to provide a much requested feature, automatic track listing for DJ mixes. ARC Cloud is a technology that has indexed over 40 million tracks in its fingerprinting database, and Hearthis.at uses this service on mixes to generate track listings automatically. Now, an interesting piece from Brad Hill of Rain News. CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, has apparently sent a number of cease and desist letters to podcast application providers, ordering them to stop distributing CBC podcasts. Now, at first glance, this seems a strange request, given that CBC podcasts are attached to RSS feeds, which of course is an open standard which freely distributes content to any site or app which can use that RSS feed. Brad asks if the existence of an RSS feed on CBC podcasts mean that CBC has implicitly given permission for podcast apps to distribute the CBC podcasts. Now, CBC's terms of use specifically say that CBC content can't be used without permission, including RSS feeds. Now, my understanding is that CBC's main concern is that while they're distributing their content via RSS for free, some of the podcast apps are playing the podcast with adverts and, of course, getting the revenue. And, of course, CBC is not seeing any revenue from this advertising, and I suspect that's the main reason for the cease and desist notices. This is going to be an interesting story to follow. I suspect some lawyers are going to do very well out of it. Lastly today, the Download on Podcasting project from Texas A&M University and DMR Interactive has released a new report which predicts that podcasting could reach $100 million in advertising revenue as an industry. There are a host of metrics mentioned from companies such as Edison Research and Zenith Optimedia in this report. These back up the projection, but the report focuses on the challenges and opportunities that are driving the emergence of podcasting as an advertising business. I'll only point out a few of the highlights here, but I'll put a link to the full report which you can download in the show notes, plus another report from the same group that gives a brief history of podcasting. So in the report there is a discussion on how podcasting will benefit from the development of the digital dashboard in cars. It talks about the importance of the links between radio and podcasting, and it also talks about how the smartphone is driving engagement in podcasting. Okay, so that's all from the Richard Daly podcast this week. If you visit my website at richarddaly.com, you'll find all my social media links, as well as the various ways you can subscribe to the show. The show notes for the episode are at richarddaly.com/20. As usual, please send me your questions or comments, and if there's a topic you'd like me to cover, then you can tweet me. Thank you for listening, and I will see you on the next episode.